So in this lesson, we are going to talk about the ways to identify and analyze theme in any story. So first of all, let's just recap what theme is. Theme is the overall lesson of the story. It's the big idea that the author wants to convey and wants you to walk away from the book or the short story still thinking about. This is a belief or an idea that transcends cultural barriers, meaning that if I were to show the same video or story or information to another group of people living in another country, they could identify the same theme from that information as long as they could read or watch or participate in that text. So it's something that's universal in nature, meaning that people would find the same overarching ideas in this story, no matter what background they have or no matter what culture they come from. How do we identify this in stories? Well, when we want to start thinking about a story's theme, the first thing we need to do is take into account the multiple aspects of the story. Okay? So we want to start thinking about all the different components that create that story. And I've given you a list here, but this is not an exhaustive list, meaning that there are more options of things to consider. But here are some to get you started. I'm going to start by thinking about the plot of the story, maybe the setting, the conflict, the different characters that you find, the resolution, the tone and the mood, metaphors, symbols, motifs or patterns that develop in the story. You could even think about point of view. Point of view is one that's not on this list but could be really influential in uncovering theme. So there's lots of different ways to start to consider the story and think about, what is the author trying to say to me through this story? So the first step is to think about the story as a whole. Before we analyze anything, we have to understand it or comprehend it. So make sure that, first of all, you understand what's going on in your story, who the characters are, whose point of view the story is told from, the major conflict that's happening in the story, the setting, right? Where are these events taking place? Or maybe there's multiple places. Don't forget the time period too. That could be very influential depending on when the story is set. And then how is the conflict resolved in the story? That's usually a big clue. As somebody is planning a story and they create a conflict, a lot of times the way that they resolve it, that author's sending you a message about something in the resolution of the story. Next, we want to think about how the characters and the conflicts are developed through the story. So think about questions like, did my character change? If you think back to the tides of change that we just read this week, I walked you through some examples of ways that Marie has grown and changed as a character. But even a character like Kino makes tremendous changes over the course of a very short story. And then you want to think about what's caused that change. Usually something provokes the change to happen in the character. And then also think about that conflict. Is the conflict tied into the change that's occurring with this character? And then maybe also think about what the character is learning from those changes. Again, if we think back to Kino in The Pearl, at the end of the story, by the time we get to those last few pages, we see Kino has changed tremendously from the beginning of the story, but he's also learned a great deal. And that clues us into one of those main themes of the story, which is, the destructive nature of greed. Because we see that now he understands that he's screwed up, he's made poor choices, and he's going to get rid of the pearl. You also want to start to think about the literary devices that are in the story and how they might be used to create deep meaning in the story. Again, if we go back to the pearl was a symbol, right? It was representative of different things for Kino and his family and his community and the other people in the community. Okay, so think about your story and think about what you can see happening in the story in terms of literary devices. Maybe there's a use of images or objects to represent an idea. That's symbolism. For example, a rose symbolizes love, an apple can symbolize knowledge. So think about ways that your story uses something symbolic. Maybe you don't have symbols, and that's okay. Think about motifs. Motifs are, this is again a very fancy, educated word, but it's really a pattern. It's a recurring thing that comes back again, whether it's an image or an idea or a symbol. In our story, The Pearl, greed was a motif in the story. Many of the characters shared those greedy feelings and the desire for the pearl and the willingness to do anything to get it. That's a motif in the story. It's a pattern that evolves. You could also think about metaphors and similes. Okay, so when you're comparing two unlike things, a lot of times we do that to help the reader to better understand what's happening in the story. And in the example that we read this week, The Tides of Change, there are several metaphors in that story. And you could think about the way that the author is using that idea of the ocean as a metaphor and the riptide as a metaphor. And all of those are kind of cluing us into some deeper meanings in the story. And then you want to put all of this information together. And that's the most difficult part of the analysis, but it's the most important part. You need to take all of these findings that you've had and look at them together and decide what message is being stated overall by the author. So all of the things you thought about should connect to the overall message in some way because the book built up to that message. That's your core takeaway in the story. So you want to think about, how does the author clue me into the idea that greed is destructive? What are the different pieces that he put in place, if I'm thinking about John Steinbeck and The Pearl, that help me to get to that place of understanding that message? There are some other ways that authors can develop theme as well, right? So we can also think about allusions or references to something. Sometimes the title of the story can be very important in giving us clues. Maybe it is metaphorical or symbolic, or it could just be cluing us into some sort of big idea that we're meant to walk away with. Sometimes thinking the thoughts with the narrator is part of developing that theme for the author, because you're seeing something through someone's perspective and we're supposed to learn something the way that they're learning it. Sometimes pictures, if the book has pictures, can be clues to help develop the theme. And there are also many other craft moves that authors can make. So think about all of these components as you're working in your book this week. Your job is to continue reading in your independent reading book and try to identify the theme in your story and then analyze how that theme is developed. Now, if you are stuck, you can always review the Tides of Change. To help you, I've linked both my lesson video and the slideshow in this folder. And of course, you could jump in with me online. Again, as I said in the directions, if you are not far enough in your book, if you just started and you're in the first 50 pages or less of a book, it may not be reasonable to think about a theme in that book. And you might want to use the book that you just finished for this week's activity, and that's okay. But if you have questions, jump in. Come see me this week in office hours. I'm happy to help if you're stuck. Happy reading.